then we'll get started. Okay, I know people are still coming in, but I'll go ahead and get some of the boring housekeeping out of the way. Good evening. My name is Chelsea Lake. I'm a member of the events team at Politics and Prose Bookstore, and I'd like to welcome you to PNP Live. Before we get started, a few of those promised housekeeping notes. At any point during the event, you can click on the link that I'll be dropping in the chat to purchase The Trials of Harry S. Truman, The Extraordinary Presidency of an Ordinary Man, 1945 to 1953. You can ask a question by clicking on the Q&A. This feature can be found along the bottom of your screen. We'll try to get to everyone's questions, but I apologize in advance if we don't have time to address yours. We are delighted to offer closed captioning for this event via Zoom's auto captioning service. To access captions, simply click on the live transcripts option, which is also along the bottom of your screen. Now, on to our event. Jeffrey Frank, author of the best-selling Ike and Dick, returns with the first full account of the Truman presidency in nearly 30 years, recounting how so ordinary a man met the extraordinary challenge of leading America through the pivotal years of the mid-20th century. Historians have tended to portray Truman as stolid and decisive, with the homespun manner, but the man who emerges in The Trials of Harry S. Truman is complex and surprising. He believed that the point of public service was to improve the lives of one's fellow citizens and was disturbed by the brutal treatment of African Americans. Yet while he supported stronger civil rights laws, he never quite relinquished the deep-rooted outlook of someone with Confederate ancestry reared in rural Missouri. The Truman who emerges in these pages is a man with generous impulses, loyal to friends and family, and blessed with keen political instincts, but insecure, quick to anger, and prone to hasty decisions. Archival discoveries and research that led from Missouri to Washington, Berlin, and Korea have contributed to an indelible and deeply human portrait of an ordinary man suddenly forced to shoulder extraordinary responsibilities, who never lost a schoolboy's romantic love for his country and its Constitution. And now to our speakers. Jeffrey Frank was a senior editor at The New Yorker, the deputy editor of the Washington Post's Outlook section, and is the author of Ike and Dick. He's published 4 novels, among them the Washington trilogy, The Colonists, Bad Publicity, and Trudy Hopedale, and is the co-author, Diana Crone Frank, of a new translation of Hans Christian Andersen's stories, which won the 2014 Hans Christian Andersen Prize. Frank will be in conversation with Sidney Blumenthal, the acclaimed author of A Self-Made Man, Wrestling with His Angel, and All the Powers of the Earth, the first 3 volumes in his 5-volume biography, The Political Life of Abraham Lincoln. He is the former assistant and senior advisor to President Bill Clinton and senior advisor to Hillary Clinton. He's been a national staff reporter for the Washington Post and Washington editor and writer for The New Yorker. Now it's my pleasure to turn the screen over to you two. Welcome.
Well, thank you, Chelsea. That was a terrific introduction of my dear friend, Jeff Frank, who I've known for decades. It's a great pleasure to be able to continue our conversation, which has been going on since the mid-'80s, when I came to the Washington Post, and Jeff became my editor there. And we went to the New Yorker, and lo and behold, Jeff was my editor there. And we have remained very good friends. Jeff's book on Truman is an extraordinary book. It's about the subtitle is The Extraordinary Presidency of an Ordinary Man. This is an extraordinary book. And part of the reason is that Jeff has a novelist's perception of character. It's very nuanced. He knows how to use the telling quote and anecdote. Is a deft stroke that illustrates not only Truman, but also an amazing cast of characters surrounding him. And I'd like to begin by asking Jeff just his general overview about Harry Truman, who has gone through a series of stereotypes about who he has been, from to air as Truman in his own time to the plain-speaking icon. And I'd like to hear Jeff's view now of his Truman.
Yeah, I really got to know Truman. I felt for the first time when I was out in Independence, and a very nice guy who worked at the Department of the Interior took me into his house. It was closed to the public, but this house in Grandview, not the Independence house that he got through his wife. And this farmhouse, you could just imagine. There was one wood-burning stove downstairs, and you could imagine really sort of cold winter days in Missouri. And for 10 years he lived there, shared a little room upstairs in this place with his brother Vivian. And there was one bedpan that they shared, these two young men. And you began to see he had a toughness that came from that. And that's when I began to see, for all he was insecure, he didn't know very much about the world, even though he read a lot of history, but he was a tough guy. And that's when that was the Truman I sort of got to know.
Well, one thing that I think people understand about Truman is that he came upon the presidency very suddenly with the death of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And he was chosen for political reasons. The scene that you describe of Truman at the Democratic Convention when he heard that he was going to be the nominee is pretty incredible to me. Why don't you tell us the story?
Well, he knew he was going to be the nominee. I mean, you're thinking there was a scene where he's down in front eating a hot dog with mustard smeared all over him. He knew by then he was going to be the nominee, but he didn't know that he was supposed to show up at the podium, and he ran, my golly, that's me. And he went running off. I've never quite decided whether he wanted to be vice president. I think he did and he didn't. I think he was a naturally ambitious man, and he saw this chance and he seized it. At the same time, I think he was kind of worried. He knew that Roosevelt was a very, very sick man. Anybody who saw Roosevelt knew that. And I don't think he imagined that he would be succeeding to the presidency in 3 months, or even in. Hi, Charlie.
That would be the dog.
The dog, or even in the first year, but it suddenly happened, and I think so. Yeah, he really wasn't ready for this to happen so suddenly. He had actually promised to nominate his chief rival, James Francis Burns. Roosevelt had promised James Francis Burns the job, and then Roosevelt reneged. And then, as Sidney says, it was a political compromise. It was either going to be Burns, who everyone had a real problem with. He'd alienated the Catholics because he left the church to become an Episcopalian. He had no black votes because he was a racist. He was a segregationist, and he opposed a lynch law. And then the other choice was Henry Wallace, the vice president for 2 terms. For 1 term under Roosevelt, and Wallace had real problems. Among them, he was suspected of being a fellow traveler, and And he wasn't, but he was a strange man who had a mixture of ideas and beliefs that were sort of a mixture of Christianity and Judaism and Buddhism and Confucianism and a number of other things.
Yeah, well, Truman didn't have any of those. And by the way, the sound of the dog, it was Truman who said, if you want a friend in Washington, get a dog. Tell us about Truman's lack of preparation for the job and what Eleanor Roosevelt said, you're going to need all of our help now, when they first met right after FDR's death. And Truman said all the stars and the moon had fallen on him.
Yeah.
Why did he feel that way?
I think, by the way, I think he really did say those things, because every account of that time from different reporters has him talking about the star and the moon and so on. He really was not ready. He knew nothing. He knew nothing about being a president. He was a pretty good senator in his second term, not so much in his first term, but no one had told him about, we have this thing called an atomic bomb. And so he had to learn about that. And other people knew about it. James Burns knew about it. And he certainly knew nothing about the world, really. The first thing he had to do, that it hadn't been set up yet, but he knew he was going to have to meet with the other sort of leaders of the leaders of the war. Winston Churchill, who was sort of running out of gas, and then Joseph Stalin, who was not running out of gas, but was a difficult and sort of chilly personality, but very, very much like the current leader of the Soviet Union, or the current leader of Russia. And he had to deal with them, and he was not a man of stature. He was a senator from a rural state who had never been out of the country except briefly. He was in France during World War I, but that was his only chance out of.
Yeah, talk about the bomb for a minute. He didn't know about the bomb. He had not been briefed about it as vice president. It was all something new to him. What did he understand about the bomb? And in terms of the decision to drop the bomb, obviously as president and commander in chief, he made that decision. But how did he think about it at the moment that he made it, and how did he later speak about it?
Yeah, I should say, by the way, I'm not sure it was a total surprise. When he was a senator looking in waste in the defense industry, he found this strange amount of money was being spent in Pasco, Washington, and he had no idea. It was a huge amount of money, and it wasn't clear what it was for. It turned out to be something that was called the Manhattan District Project, and he asked the Secretary of War Stimson. And Simpson basically shut him down. This is something I can't talk about. This is something, and when Truman pressed harder, he said this is something the president doesn't want to talk about. But then Truman learned about the bomb, and at first no one knew whether it was going to work or not. His Admiral Leahy, his chief of staff, thought it would never go off. And Truman was waiting. He was in Potsdam meeting with Stalin and Churchill when he got the word on July 16th that this test, the Trinity test, had gone off in New Mexico, and it was a huge success. It was one account where a blind woman saw the light. I don't know whether I believe that, but that was the kind of reaction it got. And Truman knew this was a really powerful thing, and Churchill felt like he just received he was strutting around. He told Churchill, of course, and they knew they had this extraordinary weapon. And there was never a question that they were going to use it. Never a question. So it wasn't that much of a decision. There had never been any serious discussion about not using it. And the first serious discussion about it was where we going to drop it. And the target committee picked Kyoto, which is this beautiful city of shrines and gardens, and it was the emperor's residence for 100 years. And it was the thought was that when the target committee picked Kyoto, so well, this will really demoralize the Japanese blowing up this city. And then Stimson, among other people, told Truman, don't do it. They will never forgive us if we do that. And Truman didn't do it. So in a way, that was his only real decision, was not to drop the bomb on Kyoto. And so Hiroshima moved up in the list, and then Nagasaki moved up. But there was no way that a president in wartime, after 3 months, with the advice of his generals, who were telling him that as many as 500,000 Americans could die, was not going to use the bomb. So, and he did. He never admitted and he said, I would do it again. He often said, I made that decision, I'll stick by it, I would have done it again. And I don't know what he really felt. I think he had misgivings about it as a matter of conscience. I think he hated the idea that 40,000 people had been killed in a second in Hiroshima, and then again in Nagasaki. I think 60,000 in Nagasaki, and then of course there was all the damage from radiation. But he never questioned his own decision.
Yeah.
And making it was not. He simply gave the order to General Spaatz, drop it as soon as we have a clear view. Drop it.
It's one of the first things he did as president. He went through two advisors as people who he appointed as Secretary of State, or three really, who were opposites. And you devote a good deal of time to Jimmy Burns in your book, who's a character lost in the mists of history now, but was considered to be a major figure in Washington at the time. And then he comes to George Marshall and to Dean Acheson. These are very different figures. And how does Truman go through these different characters? And what are his relationships?
Well, when he came to Washington as a senator in 1934, Jimmy Burns was a big guy, and he knew his way around, and no one seemed to be terribly upset by the fact that he was a racist. And then Roosevelt had given him such a big job. He was in charge of basically the war effort, and people were calling him the assistant president. He also very much wanted to be president himself, as I mentioned earlier. When Roosevelt was picking a vice president, he was lobbying very, very, very hard for the job. But Truman felt that Burns was undercutting him, and Burns was making his own foreign policy, and he so he couldn't wait to get rid of him finally. And then General Marshall, who Truman worshipped, I would say. He certainly had a very heavy man crush on Marshall, and there was no, I mean, he became Secretary of State after Burns, and then Dean Acheson. Dean Acheson was the undersecretary under Burns, and he stayed the undersecretary when Marshall came in, and he resigned. He resigned as undersecretary in 1947.
Yeah, and very quickly things turn into what we now call the Cold War, and Truman presides over that. And there's even a doctrine called the Truman Doctrine.
Yeah.
What's your sense about Truman's understanding of what was happening then?
It wasn't Truman who called it the Truman Doctrine. He was persuaded. Yeah. He was persuaded by. There were a number of things going on. He certainly had come to really distrust the Russians. He kind of liked Stalin. He thought well, Stalin was was being sort of run by the Politburo, but which was a rather naive view of who was running what over there. But what happened was that when Great Britain wasn't going to give any aid to any more aid to peace in Turkey, suddenly, basically America became, as if there was never any doubt before, but America became the world's leading super. It was the only superpower, and America was asked to step in. Dean Acheson, there was a meeting in the White House with Acheson and Truman, and Acheson basically said, the Russians are going to come in. They're going to spread their doctrine through all of Europe. They're like a rotten apple infecting all these other countries, and we have to stand up to them. And then Truman was persuaded to make this speech in March of 1947, and the speech basically was, "We're going to stand with any group, when they're being sort of overtaken by malign force," and that sort of became the Truman Doctrine. In the first instance, it was standing up. We're going to defend any country like that is facing this kind of onslaught from Russia. And there was a lot of worry. Well, I'm sorry, there was worry about that. George Kennan was one of those who thought that this is going to get us into deep trouble. We're going to have to stay. What are we going to say? We're not going to help. What are we going to be committed forever to helping any country that asks for help? And you can judge whether that actually turned out to be so or not.
Well, Kennan writes the famous article by Mr. X in Foreign Affairs. That becomes the kernel of the containment policy. That's
right, and he was right, and then Truman sort of hardened the containment policy. He had asked a couple of his aides to sort of take another look at Kennan's view, and basically they concluded, yeah, Russia is our major enemy, and that view hardened and hardened. There's an endless discussion as to who started the Cold War, and Lord knows I'm not going to say that. I mean, certainly the Russians had a major part in it. Stalin gave a speech saying we're going to catch up with the West and surpass them, and people like Kennan took this as a military threat, and probably rightly so. Certainly, Churchill was a big advocate of at one point of basically say we have to sort of deal with this sooner rather than later. There were a couple of columnists, the Alsop brothers, who said, "Let's get this. We're going to have a war with Russia. Let's get it over with." So there was an attitude of that was the Cold War, and then Walter Lippmann wrote a number of columns, and then a book called The Cold War. The term was out there, and I go into the etymology of the phrase Cold War in the book. But basically, Walter Lippmann owned the phrase, and that became it, and it hasn't ever gone away. So began in 1947, you could say, and it's still with us, with a bit of glasnost and perestroika while Mikhail Gorbachev was.
Yeah, let's turn to the domestic scene immediately while this is going on, because it has an impact on all of this in a very serious way on American politics and society, as well as the Cold War policy. And that is in 1946, a year after Truman comes to office through the death of Roosevelt. There are midterm elections, and the Republicans run on the slogan, "Had enough," and they sweep, and there's a change. And there's a feeling about Truman that he is a slight figure.
Yeah, right. There was a feel. I mean, Truman, the Republicans took Congress, the Senate and the House, for the first time since 1928, and it was such a victory that people were even suggesting that Truman should resign. The sort of most famous recommendation came from J. William Fulbright, who was, I think, a freshman senator from Arkansas then. And Truman basically, he looked at this as a vote of no confidence. Truman should resign, appoint Vandenberg, Arthur Vandenberg, as Secretary of State. Vandenberg was a Republican who was once upon a time sort of in isolation, had become a deeply bipartisan figure, and then Truman and at that point the Secretary of State was first in line to the presidency since there was no vice president and so Truman should resign and then let Vandenberg become president. So it was that kind of feeling about it, and Truman had almost no one. Everyone thought he was done for. He was going to lose. He was going to lose in 1948. And the remarkable thing is that he actually got programs through. He got money for Greece and Turkey. He wanted like $400 million in aid for Greece and Turkey. That was from the Truman Doctrine speech. And then in the summer of 1947, George Marshall presented this plan to help rebuild Europe, which was wrecked by the war. And Truman was actually worried about the expense of this thing. He didn't have all that much to do with it, but he knew he was smart enough to know that we shouldn't call this the Truman Plan. We ended up calling it the Marshall Plan, and he got that through Congress with a lot of Republicans. Among them, people like Richard Nixon, Congressman Nixon, who took a fact-finding trip through Europe and was really moved by the sight of starvation and suffering that he saw. It was a different world.
Now, here's a question I have about Truman and the Marshall Plan and the reconstruction of Europe. Truman's family had lived in Western Missouri, and they had lived through the ravages of the Civil War.
Yeah.
And how did that inform Truman's idea about reconstructing Europe?
I don't know. He didn't. The family was never really affected, even though they were only 40 miles away from Lawrence, Kansas, when Quantrill sacked it. And and it was a border state. They weren't. The Civil War. It was horrible border wars, but Truman's army did not come into Missouri, so I don't think that had any effect at all. And even though Truman was born 20 years after the Civil War was over, so I don't think it was in the air.
Pretty fresh in the air, yeah.
And in the water, but it wasn't in the forefront of his mind.
So what happened with the security policies and the loyalty policies that happened under Truman in this atmosphere of the early Cold War? then, with the Republicans rising and criticizing Truman as weak.
Well, he responded with this, what I think was the most shameful part of his presidency, something called the Federal Employee Loyalty Program, which he announced by executive order in March of 1947. And it basically what it asked for was to have there were 2 million federal employees, and they were all subject to screening, to suspicion, and sort of anything, almost anything could make you a suspicious person at that time in Washington. For example, if you had black friends, that was something suspicious. If you had books by records by Paul Robeson, that was deeply suspicious. And
also homosexuality was considered to be criminal.
Totally, but more than that.
And a security risk.
Huge security risk. You're open to blackmail, and it was the theory. And it was a terrifying time. I grew up in Washington, and I know that my parents had friends who were affected by it. My parents certainly weren't, but I think it was in the air, and it got to everyone. And you have to remember, you think of this as the red hunting was going on. There was the Hollywood investigations were going on. But this was 3 years before Senator McCarthy made his famous speech in Wheeling, West Virginia. I have a list of communists. He was basically saying the State Department was infested with communists and so on. This was Truman. This was 3 years before McCarthy that Truman did this, and you can make it. I'm not sure you can blame Truman's loyalty program for McCarthy, but it certainly contributed to the atmosphere that led to McCarthyism.
Yeah, Truman never forgave Nixon for attacking Atchison, did he?
No, of course, as you know, Nixon invited Atchison to come to the White House. They became not friends, but sort of during Vietnam, he turned to Atchison for support.
Wise man, yeah. But during this period, he called it the cowardly
containment. Yeah. He never called Atchison a
cowardly college of containment.
Yeah. And Truman thought that Nixon had called him, which he never did. Truman was very sensitive to this sort of thing, and Nixon certainly, he didn't actually cross the line if you read the speech, but he came very close to it. So maybe he did cross.
Yeah. Let's talk about Truman and race. He's a person who grows up in Missouri and has certain attitudes about race, and yet he becomes a president who introduces, equal treatment of blacks in federal employment and so on, and is outraged by the treatment of black veterans in the South when they are returned from World War II. As a veteran himself, this is a very complex story.
Yeah, let me start. I wrote something down. I thought if you were going to ask this, it's a very complex story. Truman, I have a speech that Truman gave in 1940 to the National Colored Democratic Association in Chicago, and he said, "I'm not appealing for social equality of the Negro. The Negro himself knows better than that. And the highest type of Negro leaders, quite frankly, they prefer the society of their own people. Negroes want justice, not social relations." And that sounds really racist. But in fact, when he said it in 1940, he was actually trying to win black votes in Jackson County, where his home. And it's pretty much what he always believed. He stopped saying it though, and he became deeply affected. You mentioned being a veteran. There was a case in 1946 where a man named Isaac Woodard came home. He had been in the Pacific. And he was riding a bus back home in, I think, South Carolina, and he asked the bus driver if he could use the restroom. And I don't know what they said to each other, but before it was all over, the driver called the local police, and the police used with a billy club, blinded Woodard. He put his stick right through both of my eyeballs. It was an extraordinarily brutal and hideous case, and so much so that it became that Orson Welles was having a regular 15-minute broadcast on ABC, and he read the entire affidavit that Woodard submitted. Truman didn't hear about this right away, but it got to him. It got to him. Walter White, who the head of the NAACP, told him about it, and it got to him. And Truman wrote to Tom Clark, who was no model of civility.
This is his attorney general.
The attorney general, but he said, we wanted to look into this. There were lynchings, and he thought it was pretty, and he wanted to put a stop to it. And this really affected him, I think. And in 1947 he showed up at he spoke to the NAACP in front of the Lincoln Memorial, and he stood with people like Eleanor Roosevelt, and Hugo Black, who was very pro civil rights, and with Walter White. And he helped.
Who was the head of the NAACP.
And he proposed, and that led to maybe the strongest civil rights proposal of the time. And he wanted he supported an equal employment commission, and the end of segregation in interstate travel, and all of this was pretty strong and helped Truman lose the South. Lose the Southern support in the 48
Yeah,
days.
it's sort of the beginning of the Republicans'
exactly
Southern strategy. And let's talk for a minute about the extraordinary campaign of 1948, in which there are four parties.
Yeah.
One of them is a breakaway Dixiecrat party.
Yeah.
One of them.
Yeah.
And one of them is the Progressive Party, led by the former vice president, a left-wing party, Henry Wallace. And then, of course, Thomas Dewey, who was considered to be the presumptive president to be. And then, poor Harry Truman to heir as Truman.
Yes, and furthermore, Tom Dewey he was running with Earl Warren. It was a pretty strong ticket, and so he was definitely supposed to win this thing. The Henry Wallace ticket party wasn't very strong. Wallace was furious. We should go back and say Truman. Yes, he become Secretary of Commerce as sort of a consolation prize after he was replaced by Truman on the ticket by Roosevelt, and he never quite got over that, but he really never got over it. He was fired by Truman. He was fired by Truman because he got into a big fight with Jimmy Burns. He was basically trying to make his own policy. That's a long story I get into, but he was a very angry man. And by the way, I'm not sure that he became editor of the New Republic.
For a while, he was.
Yes, briefly, and the New Republic,
which was very much my magazine at one point.
And the New Republic became strangely anti-Truman for a while, but the other party, the Dixiecrats, so-called Dixiecrats. Strom Thurmond, who was governor of South Carolina, became their nominee, and they got some real votes. I won't say they came close to throwing the election into the House of Representatives, but they disturbed things. And as Sidney would say, you can see the roots of today's Republican Party. And Strom Thurmond, a loyal Democrat, then a Dixiecrat, became a Republican, a strong Goldwater Republican in his later days. And that was
so Truman's great surprise victory is really, underneath it is the beginnings of a realignment of American politics.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, you know more about that than I do. I mean, in terms of the whole sort of history of our politics. But yes, you can really see it, and you can really see this. All these Southern senators like Thurmond and all becoming all Democrats, all becoming Republican, and the party shifted great. There were still liberal Republicans, and still lots of conservative Democrats, but that basically stopped. I would say 64, the Goldwater race is when they all began. The shift became permanent.
Yeah. 68, of course, Thurmond had become a Republican and was instrumental in the nomination of Nixon at the Republican convention. So there we have, the beginnings of, sort of the surfacing of the modern Republican Southern strategy.
Yeah, and even Jimmy Burns, who had also had real problems with Truman personally, he endorsed Eisenhower in 1952 against Adlai Stevenson. And,
tell us about Truman's view of Ike and his opponent Adlai Stevenson, the Democratic nominee. I don't want to skip over the Korean War, but let's talk about Ike and Adlai for a minute.
Well, Ike and Adlai Ike and Adlai are actually, well, they're very different. Truman didn't much like Adlai, but he actually wanted him to be the nominee. He couldn't find anybody else, and he thought, in theory, he looked so good on paper. He was the governor of, he was just elected governor of Illinois, and he was a great, very appealing character. He had one of the great speaking voices of modern. He was not Roosevelt, but pretty close. And Truman really disliked the man running against him, Senator Kefauver, who he called Senator Cowfever privately, not publicly. And so they were very different types, but Truman tolerated, he wanted Stevenson to win. Eisenhower, he really liked Eisenhower. More than that, he admired him greatly. He looked up to him. He wanted to be his friend. And they were actually very, very friendly up until Eisenhower got the nomination in '52, and even then Truman was nice to him. He said, "Oh, I wish you wouldn't do it. You're gonna hate this business of politics and so on." But then the campaign got really nasty. Eisenhower, we discovered, was really thin-skinned. He couldn't take criticism, and the sort of breaking point, it seems to me, came when Eisenhower didn't come to the defense of General Marshall after Senator McCarthy said basically the sort of the center of our policy that lost China and lost and basically saying the communists have been a sinister force running our foreign policy, and he put Marshall at the heart of it. And Eisenhower was going to say something in defense of Marshall in a speech in Wisconsin. He took it out of his speech. And because the speech had been printed in advance, everyone knew it was taken out. Truman said that was a moral lapse and called Eisenhower a weakling, and Eisenhower never forgave him, and Truman never forgave Eisenhower. This was more than politics. This was real rage on both sides.
When the background, of course, is the Korean War, and
Yes.
Which is a very difficult, bloody, violent conflict in which Truman is thrust into the middle against the heroic commander, Douglas MacArthur.
Yeah, I mean, Truman, the Korean War, I became mildly obsessed with the Korean War, so much so that I actually went over to Korea for a while, just to sort of, even just seeing the country from the air was important to me. So I could see, how could you fight a war in this place, mountains, and it made no, it was a crazy war. It was not a politically, domestically, people, it wasn't like Vietnam. People weren't really upset about it. It was just, we were supposed to win this. After all, the great victors of World War II were fighting this little pipsqueak half country, North Korea. And but before it was over, in 3 years, 37,000 Americans had been killed in Korea. Probably 1 million Chinese, hundreds of thousands of Koreans died, and nothing really had changed except that the North Koreans probably gained a little more territory than they had before the war started. And it was a terrible, terrible war. And yes, the great MacArthur really, the war could have been ended. It seems to me, and many people think so, could have been ended in 3 months after it began. Truman had no choice, it seems, probably, to commit American troops. He saw it not only as, it wasn't the Truman Doctrine so much anymore. It was the national security policy, but Truman felt he had no choice. He also wanted to support the United Nations, and so that he saw it as an important principle of supporting the independence of nations. But the war probably could have been ended in 3 or 4 months later in September. MacArthur did have one brilliant stroke, and that was a landing at Incha, where they basically.
But Truman fires it.
That was many months later, after he had defied his orders, after he had lied to him, after he had told Truman, "Oh, the Chinese will never come in," and after Truman and Atchison ignored warnings, very clear warnings, that if they pushed north, MacArthur by this time was intending to conquer the entire country, that if they pushed over there was this dividing line, the 38th parallel, that if MacArthur and they pushed north, the Chinese were going to come in. They ignored that, and the Chinese came in. And it was a terrible, terrible slaughter on basically of the Chinese, and it looked as if at that point as if the Americans would have to get out.
I want to ask you about another area, just before we go to questions, and I hope people, if they have any questions, will submit them to the Q&A part. And that is, we've talked a lot about foreign policy, and we've talked about race, but there's also other aspects of domestic policy, like the fact that Truman is really the person who pushed universal health care to start with. And the Fair Deal, that whole program.
Yeah, unfortunately, he was very serious about universal health care. It would have been not only a great policy, but it would have been something that Roosevelt couldn't have done. But it just didn't happen. He tried several times. It just wasn't going to. Congress wouldn't go along with it. The American Medical Association wasn't going to go along with it. But Truman was genuinely committed to it and tried very hard. And but it just didn't happen. I'm not sure that the so-called Fair Deal was much more than a sort of expansion of Roosevelt's programs. It was good, but it wasn't revolutionary like universal health care would have been. So Truman fell short on that. It was too bad. But when, as I pointed, when Medicare was passed, Truman and his wife Bess got the first 2 Medicare cards. And they were with Lyndon Johnson when it after it went through.
Yeah, well, he deserved some of the credit for that.
A lot of it, yeah.
Yeah. So some of these questions that have come in are factual questions, and I think you can clear them up.
Hope so.
Why didn't Truman have a vice president in his first term?
Yeah, I mean, there was no such. And when Roosevelt died, there was no provision for replacing the vice president when the vice president became president. There was a line of succession, which changed later. But at that point, say the Secretary of State became next in line, and so no, there was no vice president until the act was passed. I think in the 70s, and I think the first vice president appointed after was. Lyndon Johnson didn't have a vice president either.
Yeah.
And,
There was an amendment.
Yeah, there was an amendment to the Constitution, right, that provided for it.
So Gerald Ford would have been the first
exactly.
one appointed under that.
Right. Well, no, yes, and then Gerald Ford appointed Nelson Rockefeller.
Right.
So
here's another factual question. Did Truman consider using nukes against China in the Korean War, or was it that Truman was upset at MacArthur for his consideration of that?
I don't think Truman would have done it, even though he said things. There was one press conference when he said, "Well, we'll use every weapon at our disposal," and it was so alarming that Prime Minister Attlee rushed across the Atlantic to say, "Hey, what's going on here? We can't have this." But I don't think Truman would have done it. MacArthur was more than ready to do it. He had a list of targets ready to go, and there were other plans. Senator Gore, Al Gore's, the future vice president, Al Gore's father, Senator Gore, wanted to have a band of radioactive waste between separating China, a death row. So there were all kinds of ideas to use nuclear material, nuclear waste, nuclear weapons, but Truman was not among.
What was Truman's view of nuclear weapons, and did he understand how terrible they were? Even after, since he is the only person who used them.
I think he did. I think he understood. The pictures from Hiroshima began to come out. They were censored from the public for years, but they began to come out. Yeah, Truman understood. And Truman understood, but at the same time, Truman approved the development of thermonuclear weapons, which could be literally 1,000 times more powerful than the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. So but he saw he had no choice but to do that. But yeah, he understood. He understood they were terrible weapons, which sort of looked like, compared to thermonuclear weapons, looked like little pipsqueak bombs today.
Yeah, he met with Robert Oppenheimer, didn't he?
Yeah, he did. Several times.
And how did that go?
Well, Oppenheimer felt enormous guilt at what had happened, and Truman basically said, "Don't be a crybaby."
He's the great physicist who oversaw the Manhattan Project.
Yeah. And Truman sort of, "Don't be a crybaby," was basically the message he sent to Oppenheimer. He didn't want to hear this. He didn't want to hear sentimental mush from people who wish we hadn't dropped the bomb. As far as he was concerned, he didn't say it. We were all in on it. He gave the order, but there was no choice. And these guys built the bomb, and it was that was the sort of great flow of history meant that it was going to be dropped.
Yeah. So
yeah.
There's another question, which is about Truman and Vietnam. And, this is a period when, after World War II, the colonial empires are in crisis and in conflict and disintegrating. The British Empire, the Dutch Empire, and the French Empire. And the French are still trying to hold on to Vietnam. And was he backing the French to retake their colony?
Yeah, he was. And Acheson was asking for aid to Cambodia, Vietnam, and so on right away. Even as the war was being fought in Korea, yeah, they were very much there. I think Roosevelt would not have been on board. Roosevelt was a very anti-colonialist, but Truman had no problem supporting that sort of colonialism at the time. And no, he was very much on board. And I suppose, and he would have, and he died in 1972, so he was certainly very much aware of the war and never spoke out against it. I mean, the Vietnam War.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well.
Yeah.
So let's talk about the Republican leadership and Truman and their relationship. The questioner wants to know, what was the cause of the battles between Everett Dirksen, who was the senator from Illinois with a deep bass voice, and Truman? And apparently, Dirksen really was rabid about Truman.
But they really weren't contemporaries. I mean, that was a different era. Truman had to deal with the Senate. Apart from people like McCarthy, Truman was very lucky. He had Senator Vandenberg, who was supportive of sort of all the major foreign policy programs and so on. So Truman, it was not. I mean, you can't even begin to compare it to today's Washington. They all got along in their own way.
Yeah, why don't you describe the atmosphere of that and the institution of something called the Board of Education?
Well, that was the Board of Education was what they would. That was Sam Rayburn called meetings in his office. They were mostly Democrats, so it was a meeting in Sam Rayburn. Sam Rayburn was a congressman from Texas who never wanted to be anything more than Speaker of the House. And he became a Speaker of the House. And people would go to his office and drink. They would have a sip of what they called bourbon and branch water. Branch water was apparently came out of the tap in the bathroom, but they called it bourbon and branch water. It was a very relaxed atmosphere. But I should also say that I keep quoting. I've quoted this before, but Richard Nixon of all people. Someone asked him once, "Would you like to have a system such as they have in Great Britain, where there's the conservatives, the Tories, and Labour?" And he said, "No. In this country, both parties represent everyone," and that was true. That was pretty much true until fairly recently. The Democrats were still able to represent the entire country, and so were the Republicans. People like Jacob Javits and Rockefeller and John Lindsay and Mark Hatfield, they represented all of America, and that's gone. And that was still there when Truman was president. I'm not sure I'm being clear about this, but the parties were not polarized. They were polarized people in the parties, but the parties themselves, Democrats and Republicans, there was a lot of overlap. I think Walter Lippmann once said that the secret of our success is that there's no difference between them. And that was in some fundamental way, that was probably true at one point.
Yeah. What did Truman think of Eleanor Roosevelt? Did he have a relationship?
Yeah, I mean, sure he did.
Political relationship.
Yeah, I mean, he was never be quite certain. His relationship to her husband wasn't particularly good. Roosevelt tried to get him out of the Senate in 1940 because and Truman even was bad mouthing him even after he was gone, and never in public. And Truman was very respectful of Eleanor Roosevelt. When after the loyalty program came in, Eleanor Roosevelt spoke out against it and asked him. There was one point when a lot of people from the State Department were fired without cause, and they were, which would mean they're not only were they fired, but they probably couldn't get another job. And Eleanor Roosevelt asked Truman to get them just fired, but not fired with prejudice. And but it wasn't unfriendly either. They coexisted. And then Eleanor Roosevelt came to really praise him. She began to be portrayed Truman as this grand figure, and she understood as history went on, she began to support. She liked his views on civil rights, and she began to see him as a great figure, worthy of succeeding her husband, though not of the same.
Yeah, he was dismissed. As he went out in a kind of ignominy. And
you mean Truman did.
Truman did, yeah, and and yet people rank him differently today. How do you feel about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think these rankings are fun. I think they're a little bit silly, but I think because people rise and fall. I think we're always going to have Abe Lincoln as number one, and Truman is, and I think if someone's down there, this is great and near great, and Truman is now considered near great. I think what's so interesting about Truman is that Truman himself is, the people who really remember him. He was a completely unimpressive figure. He was a terrible speaker. He was even on the radio. He wasn't particularly good either. It was almost embarrassing to see him reading from on TV and radio, which they had even then after Germany surrendered. I mean, to sort of announce the end of the war. But as time went on, you began to see it wasn't Truman himself. It was what happened under Truman, and he got bigger and bigger. The Marshall Plan that was big, and NATO that was big, and the Truman Doctrine, which basically stopped the spread of communism, or at least set up a warning flare against the spread of communism. That was big, and lots of other, and civil rights that became big. So Truman gets credit for all this, and he should, and that's why his ranking keeps changing all the time, and deservedly so.
What would you say the most surprising thing you learned about him personally is? His character.
Yeah. That's a tough one. I mean, he kept. I guess how sentimental he could become sometimes. His sort of religious views, which he inwardly surprised me. I'm surprised he actually wrote down a prayer that he would recite to himself. I was surprised to see his views on. His views on Israel and American Jews were interesting. He would switch back.
Yeah, we never discussed that here, but he's, he had a business partner in a haberdashery.
Yeah.
Who was Jewish, who actually weighed in on the recognition of the state of Israel.
Yeah, he did.
But George Marshall, who he revered, was against it.
Yeah, but I would go even further. The only two people who Truman basically never defied or always, with whom he always agreed were Atchison and Marshall, and both of them were against the quick recognition of Israel. So yeah, Truman. This was Truman himself. This was the emotional Truman sort of doing what he thought he had to do. So that's true.
Yeah. Did he have a feeling about this from his partner, or how did he?
Yeah, definitely. I was going to say his daughter Margaret said that Eddie Jacobson had no effect at all. That's not true. Truman saw a lot of him. Eddie Jacobson. There's a story that Eddie Jacobson would talk about would talk about Chaim Weizmann and how important he was. That's probably not true. I mean, he may have said it, but Jacobson never met Chaim Weizmann. But he definitely affected Truman. He definitely pushed Truman toward the recognition of Israel, and so did others. And they really were friends. It was more than he would come to the White House sometimes, but I think the giveaway on that is that Eddie Jacobson was sometimes had been a guest at Key West, Florida, the little White House, and Truman didn't have people there who he didn't like. Yeah.
Well, let's have one final question, and it's this: how is our current president, Joe Biden, like Truman? People talk about him in reference to all kinds of presidents, but how would you think about him in the light of Truman, in the shadow of Truman, and what can Biden learn from Truman?
Yeah, I mean, that comparison is, in a sense, these are two sort of, they are truly what you see is what you get in both of them. But there's the thing that I think what Biden can also learn is that you can recover, but Truman recovered in an era when it was a much different world. The Congress was not so divided. He didn't have a united party, Republican Party, opposing everything he did. and Biden does. Biden is stuck with these Republicans who won't even talk to him, who won't even listen to him. And Truman never had that problem. And Truman could and also, by the way, there's also important to point out that Truman was a younger man, and Truman was a more vigorous man than Biden seems to be. And that counts.
We think of Truman as, from this point of view, from our vantage point today, but Truman was younger then.
When he became president, he was 60. He was 60 years old, and that seems like almost like a kid today.
Yeah. How would you compare the plain-speaking Biden and the plain-speaking Truman?
Well, neither of them were typically great. Or Truman Truman had a lot more pith. He would do it fast. He would race through his speeches, and couldn't, almost as if he couldn't wait to be done with them. That's not Biden. Biden would take his time. Does take his time.
Yeah, Truman had troubles with his economy too, and so does Biden. And
yeah, but one of the big differences is that I wish Truman would have basically a press conference every week. It was pretty impressive, and he would step up there and do it. Biden's only had one press conference so far in this year, the first 2 months of this year. So there's a difference there too. But I think that as I say, Biden can learn from Truman in the sense of I think just being honorable and doing what he thinks is right. I think that gets through to people. And I think Truman got. I think one of the reasons Truman got that second or the first full term was because people sort of knew that he believed what he was saying, and it was sort of an honor. He was an honorable guy, and I think Biden has that quality too. And I think it does get through to people, even people who say even the people who say "Go Brandon" or whatever the hell they're saying.
Well, it's a terrific book, Jeff, and I hope people will read it. I think they'll learn a lot about Truman, and also from history, learn a lot about what we're going through today.
I hope so too. And in some ways, that Truman era is 70 years ago or more, but it seems very contemporary, and it's as if it's almost as if it's meeting modern times. It never goes away, so it's very much with us still.
What a timely, lovely conversation. I wish we had more time. I think I speak for everybody in the audience when I say that. Thank you, Jeffrey Frank and Sidney Blumenthal, for an engaging hour. As was just mentioned, I have put the book link in the chat. It'll take you directly to the Politics and Prose website, where after purchasing the book, I hope that you will visit our events page. We'd love to see you at another event soon. To everyone out in the audience, thank you for joining us. To our wonderful guest speakers, thank you very much. It's been a wonderful hour. Appreciate your time.
Thank you, Chelsea. Thank you, Sidney.
Thank you.
Thank you. Take care. Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.